Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
The river beneath Magdalen Bridge was black that morning, silent, watchful, and waiting. A low mist drifted above it, curling around the stone arches, as if reluctant to move on. The bells of Magdalen College had only just finished their first chime when the cry went up. A rower, barely more than a student, had seen something caught in the reeds near the north bank. By the time the patrol arrived, the body had already begun to turn with the slow current, the hand still clutching something that refused to let go. Inspector Morse arrived minutes later, coat collar turned against the cold, the faint smell of rain and diesel from the Thames Valley van hanging in the air. He stood for a moment at the railing, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene below. The morning light was pale and unfriendly, slicing through the mist in fractured shafts. Lewis joined him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Another one who couldn't face the essays, perhaps, he muttered, attempting levity. But Morse didn't smile. No, he said softly. Look at the position. He's floating face. People who take their own lives in rivers rarely choose to face the sky. The constable below called up, male victim, sir, early 30s, dressed smartly, suit and tie. Looks like he's been in the water less than 12 hours. Morse's gaze sharpened. And what's he holding? The constable bent, prying gently at the victim's fingers. A damp, torn sheet of paper emerged, ink bleeding across the fibers. A poem, sir, handwritten. The words meant little at first glance, half-faded lines. Something about sleeping without waking. But Morse felt the rhythm of it, the deliberate placement of every phrase. It wasn't random. Someone had chosen those words for him. Take it carefully, he instructed. Get it to forensics before it disintegrates. Lewis peered down. Maybe he wrote it himself. Morse gave him a sidelong look. Or maybe someone wanted us to think that. As the divers lifted the body from the water, Morse noted the details: no wallet, no watch. But the ring finger bore a faint tan line. Married, but no ring now. Mud under the nails, but no bruising. A faint scent of tobacco and ink clung to the jacket, oddly distinct, even through the river's dampness. By the time the body was laid out on the bank, the early commuters had started crossing the bridge, their footsteps echoing faintly above. Morse crouched, brushing the silt from the man's lapel. A small crest, St. John's College. Another Oxford man, he said quietly. They do have a habit of dying poetically. Lewis frowned. You think he's a lecturer? Or someone who wanted to be one? Morse stood, glancing toward the college spires peeking through the fog. Either way, he knew his words. Back at the station, the identification came through quickly. Dr. Adrian Vale, age 34, poet and visiting lecturer in literature at St. John's, published twice in small presses, known for his melancholy verse and a failed marriage to Professor Helena Vale of Christ Church. Lewis flipped through the file. You were right about the ring. I'm right about most things, Morse murmured, though his tone lacked arrogance. It was almost weary. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the ceiling. Helena Vale. She's the one who wrote that anthology on romantic obsession. Seems to know the subject rather well. They drove to Christ Church in the early afternoon, the rain beginning again in soft, persistent sheets. The college quad glistened with puddles, reflections of the ancient stone blurring into ghostly shapes. Helena Vale greeted them in her office, graceful, distant, the kind of woman who could turn grief into an art form. Inspector, she said evenly. You've come about Adrian? Morse nodded, studying her. You've heard already. There are no secrets in Oxford, only whispers that move faster than truth. She gestured toward the chairs opposite her desk. Please, sit. The office smelled faintly of tea and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with poetry volumes and essays, their spines worn from use. A photograph on the desk showed Adrian Vale, smiling faintly beside her years younger, unburdened by whatever had brought him to the river. Lewis spoke first. We found him this morning near Magdalen Bridge. He was holding a piece of paper, a poem. Helena's eyes flickered, but her composure didn't falter. Adrian always carried fragments of verse with him. He said it helped him remember who he was. Morse watched her closely. Would you recognize the handwriting if you saw it? I might. He handed her a photograph of the recovered page, still damp, edges blurred. She studied it for a long moment, her thumb brushing one of the visible lines. It's not his, she said finally. Are you certain? Adrian's hand was neater, more deliberate. Whoever wrote this wanted it to appear poetic, but it's forced. Morse nodded slightly. You said he carried poetry with him. Would anyone else have known that? Helena hesitated. Perhaps his students. He mentored a few at the university's literary society, one in particular, Ed Crane. Talented, but unstable. Adrian believed in him more than he should have. Lewis scribbled the name down. We'll talk to him. Morse remained silent, his eyes drifting toward the window. The rain had thickened, streaking the glass, the sound steady and relentless. When did you last see your husband? 2 nights ago. Her voice was softer now. He came here, he said. He'd written something new, something that would make everything right again. I told him, there's no such thing. Did he seem afraid? Morse asked. Helena's gaze lingered on the rain outside. Not afraid, resigned, as though he knew the ending already. They left her office in silence, crossing the slick stones of the quad. Lewis finally spoke. You think she's telling the truth? Morse didn't answer immediately. Truth, he said eventually, is just another form of poetry. Lewis, the trick is knowing who's writing it. That evening, as the city darkened and the colleges lit their lamps, Morse sat in his office with the recovered poem laid out before him under a magnifier. The ink was uneven, applied with haste, but one thing caught his attention. The final word had been rewritten. Beneath the visible line, I sleep without waking, faintly beneath the paper's surface, was another word scratched out. Forgiven. He leaned back, the corners of his mouth tightening. Not suicide, he murmured. A message. Lewis entered, carrying 2 coffees. What kind of message, sir? Morse turned the photo toward him. A conversation between the living and the dead, and I think someone else plans to write the next verse. Outside, the bells of Magdalen tolled again, echoing faintly across the river, where the mist had returned thin, silver, and patient. The water moved beneath it, silent as breath, carrying away the first line of a poem that wasn't finished yet. Rain continued to whisper against the windows of the Oxford station, as Morse sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the page before him. The poem, if it could still be called, that had begun to yield its secrets. He'd spent the better part of the night analyzing every stroke of the pen, each indentation on the damp paper. Someone had written it in haste, yes, but not without intent. The lines were too deliberate, the phrasing too self-conscious. Whoever had done this knew poetry well enough to imitate despair, and that made them dangerous. Lewis entered, balancing 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of Morse with the caution of a man offering a peace treaty. Forensics just called. The handwriting doesn't match Dr. Vale's journals. Different slant, heavier pressure. But they found traces of graphite on the fold. Someone sketched over it before writing, almost like rehearsal marks. Morse looked up, intrigued. Practiced handwriting? Lewis nodded. Or an artist trying to make it look right. Interesting, Morse murmured. Our killer not only writes poetry, but edits their drafts. Perfectionist tendencies. Likely educated, which narrows Oxford down to about half the population. He pushed back his chair. Come on, Lewis. Let's pay a visit to this poet's circle, Mrs. Vale mentioned. The Oxford Literary Society met in a converted chapel behind St. John's. Its vaulted ceiling now hung with fairy lights and old banners from readings long past. When Morse and Lewis entered, the smell of paper, ink, and damp coats filled the air. A small group had gathered 5 students and 1 lecturer, all arranged in a semicircle around a low table cluttered with notebooks and coffee cups. At the head sat a young man with sharp features and restless Elliot Crane. His clothes were neat but rumpled, his fingers stained with ink. He looked up as Morse approached, wary but curious. "You must be Inspector Morse," he said, voice low and confident. "We heard about Dr. Vale. Tragic, really." "Tragic is one word for it," Morse replied. "You knew him well?" "I was his student. He believed in me more than most." Elliot's gaze flickered briefly toward a girl seated across from him, a quiet student with auburn hair who avoided Morse's eyes. He thought poetry could save a man from himself, and did it? Morse asked softly. Elliot's smile was brief and bitter. "It depends who the man was." Lewis looked around the room, taking in the students' faces. "You all meet here regularly?" "Every Thursday," said the girl with auburn hair. "We read each other's work. Dr. Vale would come sometimes. He said it kept him connected to the world." "Did he seem troubled lately?" She hesitated. "He always seemed troubled. That was part of him. But last week, he looked frightened. He said he'd written something dangerous, that words could kill, if you knew how to use them." Morse's gaze sharpened. "Did he show you what he meant?" She shook her head. "No, but Elliot saw it." All eyes turned to Crane. He shifted in his seat. "He showed me a draft. Yes, just a few lines. He said it was part of a new collection, the River Psalms. Something about drowning in truth. I told him it was bleak, even for him. Did you keep a copy?" Morse asked. "No." Elliot leaned back. He took it with him. Said it wasn't ready to be read by anyone else. Morse studied him in silence. There was something too measured about the young man's tone, as if each word had been chosen with care. "And where were you last night, Mr. Crane?" Elliot's lips curved slightly. "Writing, Inspector. Alone. You can ask my flatmate if you like, though. I doubt he'd notice whether I was dead or alive." Morse's eyes lingered on him a moment longer before turning to Lewis. "We'll do that." As they left, the rain had turned to a fine drizzle, coating the cobblestones in a sheen of silver. Morse paused under an archway, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, catching the lamplight. "What do you make of him, Lewis?" "Crane? Brilliant type, maybe too clever for his own good. But I don't see him killing his mentor." "Nor do I," Morse admitted. "But I see someone who's learned how to manipulate an audience. And Murder Lewis is just another performance." Back at the station, preliminary reports came in. No signs of struggle on the body, but there was residue of incendia, ink beneath the victim's nails. Morse turned that detail over in his mind. "So he fought to hold on to something," he said. "Or someone tried to make him hold it." Lewis frowned. "You think he was forced to write that poem?" Morse shook his head. "Not right. Hold. As if the killer wanted us to find it that way. A message presented like a final stanza." That evening, Morse returned to the college on foot. The chapel where the poets met was locked, but a light glowed faintly from the back window. He circled around, pushing open a side door that creaked in protest. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wax and damp stone. On the central table, new pages lay scattered. Someone had been there recently, still with ink on several sheets. Morse lifted one carefully. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, precise, and the words haunting. "He sleeps beneath the river's glass, the poet's breath, the final mass, and in his silence, one shall see, the face of guilt belongs to me." Morse's pulse quickened. The ink was still drying. Whoever had written it was close. He turned sharply at the sound of a door creaking open. Elliot Crane stood there, his expression unreadable. a flicker of surprise, or a calculation passing through his eyes. "Inspector, you shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," Morse said quietly. "You write well, Mr. Crane? A touch dramatic, perhaps, but precise. Almost confessional." Elliot's mouth twitched. "You think I wrote that?" "I think you're playing a dangerous game," Morse replied, "one that began long before Dr. Vale died." Elliot stepped closer, the faint light casting shadows across his face. "Adrian Vale stole my words, Inspector. My lines, my voice. He published my work as his own. You think I'd kill him for that?" Morse's eyes narrowed. "I think a poet might kill for less." They stood in silence for a moment, the rain tapping faintly on the stained glass above. Then Elliot's expression shifted defiant, almost amused. "If you want the truth, Inspector, read the last poem he wrote. It wasn't about drowning." Morse frowned. "What was it about?" Elliot met his gaze. "Redemption." Before Morse could respond, the young man turned and slipped into the night, his footsteps vanishing down the wet cobbled path. Morse remained in the empty chapel, staring at the ink-stained table. The faint hum of the city echoed beyond the stone walls, and for the first time, Morse felt the stirrings of something darker beneath the surface, something that wasn't just murder, but art turned cruel. He looked again at the last line on the page, the ink still glistening. "The face of guilt belongs to me." Morse exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. "Or," he whispered to himself, "to the one who wanted us to believe it." And outside, the river flowed on silent, indifferent, carrying with it the first verse of a story that refused to stay buried. The morning sun struggled through a gauze of mist that clung to Oxford's rooftops, softening the city into pale gold and gray. Inspector Morse stood at his window, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the sill from the night before. Sleep had been a luxury. Questions had not. The poem? The ink? Elliot Crane's cryptic words, redemption. They turned in his mind like the refrain of an unfinished symphony. A sharp knock broke through his thoughts. Lewis entered, coat still damp, clutching a folder. "Morning, sir. We've got something. Dr. Vale's widow finally agreed to see us." Morse turned, eyebrow lifting. "Ah, Mrs. Vale. The one who refused to identify her husband's body yesterday. She said she wasn't ready, but she's asked us to come today. There's something she wants to show you." Morse reached for his coat, ignoring the chill creeping through the room. "Then let's not keep a grieving widow waiting, especially one who's suddenly changed her mind." The Vale residence sat at the edge of North Oxford, a tall, ivy-covered townhouse with its curtains drawn and a single light burning in an upstairs window. When Mrs. Vale answered the door, she was a vision of quiet composure, wrapped in grief. Her hair was pinned back neatly, but her eyes sharp, intelligent. Wounded betrayed sleeplessness. "Inspector," she greeted softly, "please, come in. I wasn't myself before. It was all too sudden." The house was heavy with the scent of lilies and old books. Framed photographs lined the hallway. Dr. Vale, at lectures, smiling with colleagues, reading to children at some charity event. Yet there was something ghostly about them now, smiles preserved in glass that no longer meant anything. In the sitting room, Mrs. Vale gestured for them to sit. "You're here about Adrian's note. The poem," Morse corrected gently. "Yes? We have reason to believe it may have been written under duress or by someone else." Her expression flickered. "No, he wrote it. I know his hand as well as my own, but it wasn't meant to be found that way." Lewis leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then rose and crossed to a small writing desk near the window. From a drawer, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, thin, yellowed, and trembling slightly in her hands. "He left another one, hidden inside his book of sonnets. I found it last night." Morse took the paper carefully. The handwriting matched the note from the river, though this one was steadier, the ink controlled. It read, "If truth be silence, love be crime, then mark the widow's final rhyme. For death will come, in borrowed name, and leave behind the poet's shame. Morse's brow furrowed. The widow's rhyme. He looked up at her. Did he ever explain these lines to you? Mrs. Vale's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. He said poetry was confession disguised as art, that every poem tells the truth if you know where to listen. Did he have enemies? She gave a faint, ironic smile. He was a critic, inspector. His enemies wrote in ink and called them reviews. Morse studied her carefully. Beneath the calm exterior, something trembled, a restraint, too perfect, too measured. Your husband was afraid, he said softly. He told his students as much. He said he'd written something dangerous. Her hand went to her throat. He said that, yes. I thought it was just his dramatics. He'd been working on a new poem, one he refused to show me. He called it The Widow's Rhyme. Lewis frowned. The same phrase. Yes, she whispered. He said it was about betrayal, about being silenced. Morse glanced toward the window, where the light caught the faint reflection of his own face. Mrs. Vale, I'll need to see that poem, the final version, if it exists. She hesitated again. There's a safe upstairs. He kept drafts there, letters too. I don't have the key. Morse's tone softened. Would you mind if we took a look anyway? She nodded silently, leading them up the narrow staircase to a study filled with books and the faint scent of tobacco. A mahogany desk stood by the window, dusted with fine ash. On it, an unfinished glass of whiskey mirrored the one Morse had left in his own flat. Lewis found the safe behind a framed landscape. Locked, sir. Morse crouched beside it, tracing the numbers on the dial. Try his wife's birthday first, he murmured. Lewis hesitated. A bit of a cliché. I sent it. Poets thrive on cliché, Morse replied. 3 clicks later, the safe opened with a sigh. Inside were several notebooks, a slim envelope, and an old fountain pen still streaked with dried ink. Morse lifted the envelope and unfolded its contents. More verses unfinished this time, but scrawled at the bottom, in hurried strokes, were the words, "She knows." Morse's pulse quickened. Lewis, look at this. Lewis leaned in, brow furrowed. You think it refers to his wife, or someone else entirely? Morse turned the page over and froze. The back held a single fingerprint, faint but visible, smeared with black ink. Not Mrs. Vale's. He was sure of that. Get this to forensics, he said quietly. As Lewis left the room, Morse remained, gazing at the unfinished poem. The lines seemed to echo in his mind, weaving together with Eliot Crane's bitterness, the widow's composure, the ink beneath Vale's nails. There was a rhythm forming one of guilt and confession, masked by art. Behind him, the floor creaked. He turned. Mrs. Vale stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly. Inspector, there's something else, she said softly. Adrian received a letter 2 days before he died. It upset him terribly. I wasn't supposed to see it, but, she hesitated, then retrieved a folded paper from her coat pocket. Morse unfolded it. The writing was elegant, almost theatrical. The poem ends where the river begins. Don't let her sing the last verse. There was no signature, only a faint watermark, a crest, shaped like a quill in flame. Morse recognized it instantly. Christchurch Literary Society, he murmured. A closed group. Invitation only. Mrs. Vale nodded. He left the house that night saying he had to meet someone from that circle. He never came back. Morse felt a familiar chill trace the back of his neck. Someone wanted him silenced, but not before he could confess something. Something worth killing for. She looked at him, fear now plain in her eyes. Inspector, if he was confessing, what if it wasn't his sin? Morse didn't answer. He was already thinking ahead to the ink, the poems, the circle of young writers, where jealousy and art blurred too easily. Somewhere among them lay the truth Vale had tried to bury in verse as he stepped outside. The afternoon light fractured across the wet pavement. The wind carried the faint echo of a bell from Magdalen Tower, tolling noon like a lament. Morse paused, the widow's words still in his mind. If truth be silence, love be crime. Every rhyme's a confession, he murmured to himself. You just have to know who's speaking. He turned toward the direction of Christchurch, coat flaring behind him as the bells faded into distance, leaving Oxford steeped once more in quiet deceit and poetic death. Oxford was darker that evening than it had any right to be. The lamplight swayed in the river breeze, and the shadows of Magdalen Bridge stretched long and restless across the cobblestones. Inspector Morse walked briskly beneath them, coat collar turned up against the drizzle, his mind circling the puzzle like a hawk above water. Every line of poetry, every fragment of verse, seemed to taunt him with half-dashed truths. Dr. Vale had died beside the river. Eliot Crane had written of guilt, then vanished into the rain, and the widow composed, brittle, haunted had whispered of betrayal and silence. Somewhere between the poems lay the truth, but one line was missing. The verse that vanished. Lewis caught up, umbrella in hand. Sir, forensics called. That fingerprint from the safe fits, not the widow's, and it's not Crane's either. Belongs to a woman. Partial match in the university's employment database, possibly someone in the archives. An archivist. Morse mused, stepping over a puddle. That would make sense. Poets and professors have a peculiar fondness for keeping their ghosts catalogued. Lewis gave a wry smile. Name's Lydia Trent. Works in the Bodleian Library. She's on duty tonight. Then let's not keep her waiting. The Bodleian was hushed, its stone halls holding centuries of whispered secrets. A faint scent of parchment and polish hung in the air. Behind the main desk, Lydia Trent looked up as they approached a woman in her late 30s. With sharp eyes and a scholar's calm. Her fingers were ink-stained, her sleeves rolled just past the wrist. Inspector Morse, she greeted, her tone neutral, but aware. I was told you might come, were you? Morse asked, studying her face. By whom? She hesitated, then smiled thinly. By Oxford itself, perhaps. Rumors travel faster than truth in this city. Lewis stepped forward. We're investigating Dr. Adrian Vale's death. Your fingerprint was found on a page in his safe. Her expression flickered not surprise, but something close to regret. I returned a borrowed draft to him last week, a handwritten poem he'd asked me to authenticate. He said it was centuries old, but it wasn't. Tit was his. I told him so. Why the secrecy? Morse asked quietly. He was paranoid. She said simply. He claimed someone had stolen his earlier work lines from his private journals, hidden inside other writers' publications. He wanted to prove he'd been plagiarized, but the evidence was always missing. The verse that vanished, Morse murmured. She looked up sharply. Yes, that's what he called it. Lewis frowned. And what did this missing verse say? Lydia shook her head. He never showed me. Only that it was part of a confession he'd written years ago. He said, if it ever surfaced, someone would kill to hide it again. Morse leaned closer, voice low. Did he mention who? She hesitated, then whispered, a poet named Ellis Crane. Lewis blinked. You mean Eliot? She nodded slowly. No, Ellis, his father, died 15 years ago. Suicide, apparently. But Adrian didn't believe it. He said Ellis was silenced. Morse straightened, his pulse quickening. So the son inherits the same obsession, the same gift, perhaps even the same guilt. And now the old wound reopens. Lydia's eyes flicked toward the upper gallery. You're not the only one looking for the verse. Someone broke into the archives last night. Nothing stolen, but drawers were moved, records checked. They knew what they wanted. Show me, Morse said. She led them through the maze of shelves, to a locked cabinet, its door slightly ajar. Inside lay manuscripts arranged in meticulous order except one slot, empty but for a thin ribbon marker. The label beneath read, E. Crane, Unpublished Works, 1957 to 59. Lewis exhaled. So the missing verse was his father's, not Vale's. Or both, Morse said grimly. A poem can have two authors if one is stealing from the other. Lydia looked uneasy. Inspector, you should know Vale once lectured about Ellis Crane's work. He said, poetry could preserve guilt, like fossils in ink. I think he found something he wasn't meant to find. Morse turned, his mind fitting the pieces together with deliberate precision, and Elliot Crane would have known his father's words anywhere. Imagine the shock of hearing them resurrected under another man's name. Lewis frowned. Revenge. Then, revenge wrapped in verse, Morse said softly. Before they could speak further, the lights above flickered. Lydia looked up, startled. A moment later, a figure darted between the upper stacks, a shadow too fast for detail. Morse ran, footsteps echoing off the stone. The stairwell spiraled upward, air thick with dust. Stop, he shouted, but the figure kept moving, vaulting over a railing, a glint of silver flashing briefly, a penknife. By the time Morse reached the far end, the door to the alley was open, rain sweeping in. The intruder was gone. Lewis appeared moments later, breathing hard. Lost him. Lost the verse too, Morse said grimly. He had it in his hand. They searched the courtyard, but only found a scrap of soaked paper clinging to a bench. Morse peeled it free, the ink running like blood. Only one legible line remained. The poet kills not with blade, but with silence. He stood there in the drizzle, the bells of Christ Church chiming across the distance. The words echoed against the memory of Vale's corpse, the widow's rhyme, and the dead poet, whose voice had somehow returned from the grave. Lewis, he said at last, I want everything you can find on Ellis Crane's death. Autopsy, police notes, family background, and trace Elliot's whereabouts tonight. Lewis hesitated. You think the son's continuing his father's work? I think he's finishing it, Morse replied. They returned to the station past midnight. Both men silent, the city glistening like a wet canvas of sin. Morse sat at his desk, turning the fragment of paper under the lamp. The letters seemed to shimmer with meaning just beyond reach. He poured himself a whiskey, watching the golden light ripple through the glass. The verse that vanished, he murmured. Perhaps it wasn't lost at all. Lewis looked up. Meaning, Morse said, eyes fixed on the paper. That the poet who killed May have never stopped writing. And outside, the rain began again, soft, relentless, as if washing away words no one dared to read aloud. The next morning, Oxford woke beneath a low sky, the color of pewter. The drizzle had ceased, but the air still clung to the scent of rain and stone. Inspector Morse arrived at the station early, his mood a reflection of the weather gray, deliberate, and unrelenting. The scrap of paper from the Bodleian lay before him, now dried and pressed flat, its faint, almost ghostly words, the poet kills not with blade but with silence, had haunted his thoughts through the night. Lewis entered with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of files under his arm. Got the reports you asked for, sir. Everything on Ellis Crane's death and the son's background. And well, you might want to sit for this. Morse gestured impatiently. Go on. Ellis Crane didn't kill himself. Not conclusively anyway. The original investigation was rushed. No autopsy photographs, no fingerprints lifted from the scene. And the note he left half a page, typewritten, went missing from evidence a year later. Morse frowned, rubbing his temple. And the official word, suicide due to creative despair, Lewis replied. But here's the odd part. The note he left reportedly contained a poem, a short verse. No one ever recorded it, but the title was logged. Silence between lines. Morse's gaze sharpened. Silence between lines, he repeated softly. The same motif Vale was studying. The same theme the son now writes about. It's not coincidence, it's inheritance. Lewis set down another file. There's more. Lydia Trentha, archivist, she's gone. Didn't turn up for work today. Her flat's been cleared out, wardrobe empty, bookshelves bare. Landlord says she left before dawn. No forwarding address. Morse stood slowly, the familiar hum of danger settling in his chest. Then she found something last night, he said. Something worth running for or dying over. The two men left the station and drove through the narrow streets toward Jericho, where Lydia's flat overlooked a row of aging brick terraces. The curtains fluttered slightly in the open window, as though she had left in a hurry. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and old perfume. Morse moved carefully through the rooms, eyes scanning every corner. A kettle sat cold on the counter, beside a teacup still half full. On the table lay a torn envelope, the Oxford postmark barely legible. Inside, a single folded sheet of poem typed neatly on cream paper. The title read, "For the One Who Reads Too Deeply." Morse unfolded it with care. Between the stanzas, "Where shadows sleep," lies a name the ink dares not keep. A truth too quiet, a silence too loud. Find it before it joins the shroud. He read it twice, then a third time, each word tightening the knot in his mind. "She left this for us," he said. "A warning or a trail?" Lewis pointed toward the envelope's torn edge. "Look, there's a faint stamp impression underneath. Could be from a university seal." Morse held it to the light. The crest of St. Hilda's College shimmered faintly in the watermark. "Vail lectured there," he murmured. "And Ellis Crane's wife worked there as a librarian before she—" He stopped himself. Lewis finished quietly. "Before she died. Another suicide." They exchanged a glance heavy with implication. By noon, the two were crossing the quad at St. Hilda's, where the fog was beginning to lift. The college looked serene, but beneath its calm, Morse felt the weight of old secrets pressing against the walls. The head librarian, a precise woman named Mrs. Ives, met them with thin-lipped disapproval. "I don't appreciate police intrusions during term time, Inspector. What is it you're looking for?" "A record," Morse replied evenly. "From the 1960s. Staff files concerning a Mrs. Marion Crane." Mrs. Ives frowned, but turned to her cabinet. "Most of those are archived off-site, but we keep summaries." She handed over a manila folder. Inside were brief employment records, start and end dates. References, nothing extraordinary. But Morse noticed a handwritten annotation in the margin of her final entry. "Resigned following personal tragedy. Manuscript retained." He looked up sharply. "Manuscript." Mrs. Ives pursed her lips. "Something she was compiling for her husband. A collection of his unfinished work. It was never published." "Where is it now?" Morse asked. "In the rare books vault," she said. "But it's sealed family restriction." "Whose authority?" "Elliot Crane's," she said simply. Lewis exhaled. "Of course it is." Moments later, they were in the vault, a dim, temperature-controlled chamber lined with steel cabinets. The attendant produced a slim box wrapped in archival linen. Inside lay a sheaf of yellowed pages, bound by ribbon. The first line on the title page read, "Shadows Between the Lines, Poems by Ellis Crane." Morse turned a few pages, his eyes narrowing. "Look here," he said, pointing to a stanza. "It's identical to one in Vail's last books. Same rhythm, same punctuation. He didn't just study Crane's work, he copied it." Lewis frowned. "So Vail stole Ellis Crane's poems and, when the son found out, he killed him to silence the theft," Morse said. "Poetic justice in its purest form. But something didn't fit. The handwriting in the margin, it looping, wasn't Vail's or Ellis's. It was Marion Crane's, and beside one verse, she had written a single chilling note. He knows." "He knows what?" Lewis asked quietly. Morse didn't answer. He flipped another page and froze. Beneath the final poem lay an unfinished stanza, the ink slightly smeared. as if written in haste, and should the reader seek my ghost, tell him the silence speaks the most. Beneath the bridge where poets weep, the river keeps what they can't keep. Magdalen Bridge, the same place Vale had been found dead. Morse's throat tightened. Lewis, he said softly, this isn't just about plagiarism or revenge, it's a pattern. The verse predicts the crime scenes. You think Ellis Crane's poems are being used as blueprints? Not just used, Morse replied, continued. Before Lewis could respond, a sound echoed faintly through the corridor footsteps, soft but deliberate. Morse closed the manuscript, motioning for silence. The vault door creaked slightly, a shadow crossing the light. Then came a voice, calm, resonant, disturbingly familiar. Inspector, it said, you shouldn't have opened that. Morse turned. Elliot Crane stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his coat, eyes hollow, but burning with conviction. In his hand, a revolver gleamed faintly beneath the fluorescence. This isn't your story, Elliot said, stepping closer. It's mine. My father wrote of truth no one dared face. Vale tried to steal it. Lydia tried to bury it. He raised the gun slightly. You read too deeply. Morse's voice was steady. And what do you think killing me will do, Mr. Crane? End the poem. Elliot's jaw tightened. No, it will complete it. Lewis shifted behind the table, inching toward the emergency alarm. But before he could act, Elliot's gaze flicked toward him. Don't, he warned. Elliot, Morse said calmly, your father's words weren't prophecy, they were confession. He wasn't killed. He took his own life because he couldn't live with what he'd done. The gun wavered slightly. Lies, Elliot hissed. He was silenced. Morse took a slow step forward. And you've spent your life trying to give his silence meaning. But it's not truth. You're defending its guilt. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Elliot's hand trembled, the revolver lowering an inch. His eyes glistened with something like exhaustion. You don't understand, he whispered. The words, they live through us. I do understand, Morse said quietly. But words can't absolve the living by killing the innocent. A single tear rolled down Elliot's cheek. Then, without another word, he placed the revolver on the table and turned away. As Lewis secured the weapon, Morse glanced again at the manuscript hit's title, staring back at him like a whisper. Shadows between the lines. Outside, as the rain began anew, Morse lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift toward the gray Oxford sky. Funny thing about poets, he said softly, they never really die. They just change the ending. The rain had stopped by evening, but Oxford still glistened under a sheen of damp, every cobblestone slick with reflection. The city seemed to hold its breath, the hum of distant traffic fading into the weight of something unsaid. Inside the precinct, the evidence table was crowded with papers, Vale's notebook, Lydia Trent's cryptic poem, the recovered manuscript, and a single photograph of Elliot Crane being led away. Lewis poured himself a cup of tea and leaned against the desk. He's been quiet, sir. Hardly said a word since the arrest. Jez keeps asking for a book, his father's poetry collection. Morse didn't look up from the open file in front of him. He's not done yet, Lewis. With what, sir? The story, Morse murmured. Men like him, they can't leave the ending unwritten. He rubbed at his temple. The manuscript had been gnawing at him since the vault. Its verses weren't just melancholic, they were deliberate, coded. Each poem seemed to mark a place, a moment of death, like a map written in metaphor, and one line from the final page still echoed in his mind, in the library's hush. The final word bleeds. That night, long after the station lights dimmed and Lewis had gone home, Morse sat alone in his office. The city clock struck 11. His eyes drifted toward the window, the mist curling over Oxford's spires. And then back to the manuscript. He flipped to the last page again. A faint indentation marked the bottom corner, as if something had once been pressed there. He held it to the desk lamp, and a ghostly outline appeared, letters faint but legible. BL12. The Bodleian Library. Shelf 12. Morse's pulse quickened. He grabbed his coat, the old tweed hanging like armor, and stepped into the night. The Bodleian stood silent, its great wooden doors locked, its Gothic windows gleaming under the glow of lamplight. But Morse knew another way in. Years of inquiry had their uses, and a forgotten side entrance near Radcliffe Square yielded easily to his practiced hand. Inside, the air was cold, dry, and ancient, the scent of vellum and dust heavy in the lungs. He switched on his small torch, its beam slicing through the darkness like a whisper. Shadows stretched along the endless rows of books, each aisle an echoing corridor of thought and secrets. His footsteps were soft on the marble floor as he made his way toward the restricted archives. The manuscript section, room B, shelf 12, stood behind a wrought iron gate. It creaked as he eased it open, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. There it was, Ellis Crane collected works on, but something was wrong. The spine of the volume was hollow, a shell that concealed a second binding inside. Morse carefully pulled it free. Inside the false cover was not poetry but a diary. He opened it, breath steady, eyes scanning the faded ink. The first entries were Ellis Crane's mundane, reflective, about his lectures and literary disputes. But as the dates drew closer to his death, the tone shifted, the words trembling with guilt. He knows. Vale knows what I took. The verse was never mine. I stole it from her. From Marion. Morse stopped cold. From her. The next line was even worse. She begged me to confess. I couldn't. She left the bridge before I could stop her. Marion Crane hadn't killed herself because of grief. She'd discovered her husband's theft, the betrayal buried in his success. And Vale, years later, had uncovered the same secret, threatening to expose the truth that Ellis Crane's fame had been built on stolen words. Morse turned another page. The final entry was dated 2 days before Ellis's death. If I must atone, I'll do so where she fell. The river will take what it's owed. The inspector's breath caught. It wasn't murder, it was confession. But then, beneath the final lines, a different hand had written, an addition bolder, sharper, more recent. He confessed, but not enough. The words live on. They must be cleansed. It was Elliot Crane's handwriting. Morse felt the air shift behind him, subtle, but there. He turned slowly. Someone else was in the library. The faint scuff of a shoe echoed down the aisle. He switched off his torch and waited, letting his eyes adjust to the silver glow of moonlight filtering through the stained glass. The figure moved closer, a silhouette between the shelves, a slender frame. Careful steps. Inspector, a voice whispered. Lydia Trent emerged from the shadows, pale and rain-soaked, her eyes hollow. You're supposed to be gone, Morse said quietly. I was, she replied, but he found me, Elliot, before they took him. He said you'd come here tonight. He wanted me to finish it. Finish what? The poem. Her hand trembled as she held out a folded sheet of paper. Morse took it carefully. The same cream paper, the same typeface, a single stanza, newly typed. The truth lies bound beneath the light, where scholars read by borrowed sight. When ink runs red, the tale will close. The poet sleeps, the reader knows. He looked at her. What does it mean, Lydia? Tears streaked her face. It means I couldn't stop him. He sent someone else before they caught him. Someone loyal. They're here, now. Morse felt a sudden chill as a sound echoed from the far end of the hall, the heavy thud of a door closing. Get behind me, he whispered, but before either could move, the lights flickered. A shadow moved fast along the upper gallery, descending the staircase in silence. The shape that emerged wore a long black coat, face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Morse's voice was low but firm. Oxford said, drop whatever you're carrying. The figure paused. A glint of metal caught the lamplight, a knife, slender and polished like a pen. It wasn't supposed to end this way. The voice said a man's, trembling with emotion. He wanted the truth remembered, not buried. Morse recognized the tone, the soft cadence of academia. "Vale's student," he said. "Eerie his protege." The man stepped into view, eyes wild but strangely calm. "He wasn't just my mentor, Inspector. He was the only one who understood what poetry really meant. He died for his words. You want justice, but justice kills art." He lunged forward. Morse caught his wrist, the knife scraping across his sleeve. Books cascaded to the floor, the noise shattering the stillness. Lydia screamed, the echo spiraling through the chamber. Lewis's voice cut through the chaos. "Morse." He burst through the entrance, revolver drawn. The attacker froze, breathing hard, knife trembling. Morse straightened, hand still on the man's shoulder. "It's over," Morse said. "No verse is worth a life." The man dropped the knife. The sound of it hitting the marble was final, sharp, conclusive. Later, outside the library, dawn was breaking over Oxford. Lewis stood beside Morse, who stared up at the pale sky with tired eyes. "Never seen you this quiet." "Sir," Lewis said softly. Morse exhaled smoke from his cigarette, watching it drift toward the clouds. "It's strange, Lewis. The closer you get to the truth, the more it starts to look like poetry, beautiful, tragic, and full of lies." Lewis looked at him, brow furrowed. "So, was Elliot Crane the killer, or the poem?" Morse gave a faint, weary smile. "Sometimes, Lewis. They're the same thing." The bells of Magdalen College began to toll as the first rays of sun broke through the mist, and the library doors behind them creaked shut, sealing their secrets for another century. Morning broke over Oxford in soft gold and ash gray, the rain-washed city slowly stirring beneath the toll of distant bells. Inspector Morse stood by his office window, eyes fixed on the spire of Magdalen College visible through the mist. His cigarette smoldered between two fingers, forgotten, a thin trail of smoke winding upward, like an unfinished thought. The previous night at the Bodleian had ended in chaos, one arrest, one confession, and a truth that still didn't feel whole. Lewis entered quietly, balancing 2 cups of tea. "No milk. Just how you like it." Morse took it absently, his gaze distant. "He wasn't lying, Lewis. Not entirely." "Who, sir?" "Vale's student. He's confessed." "Yes, but not to the right crime." Morse set the cup down. "He didn't kill Vale. He protected someone who did." Lewis frowned. "You think Elliot Crane's still behind this?" "I think Elliot never stopped writing his father's story," Morse replied, his voice low. "Even from a cell." He turned from the window, the weariness in his face shadowed by something deeper, conviction, perhaps, or the ache of a truth too close for comfort. He reached for the thin file lying open on his desk. Inside was a photocopy of the last poem, the one found in Lydia Trent's coat pocket. "The poet sleeps. The reader knows." "Lewis," he said, tapping the line, "find out if Elliot's been allowed visitors since the arrest, particularly anyone connected to the university." Lewis hesitated, already sensing the shape of the answer. "Lydia Trent." Morse nodded slowly. "She's cleverer than she looks, and she's been playing both sides since the start." By afternoon, the two men stood once again beneath the gray arches of Oxford Prison. The air inside was heavy, echoing with the slow shuffle of guards and the faint clang of metal doors. Elliot Crane sat behind the glass partition, pale and composed, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Inspector," he said softly, "come to read me my obituary." Morse leaned forward. "Just your final stanza." Crane's eyes flickered amusement, curiosity, perhaps a trace of fear. "You've always had a way with words, Inspector. But tell me, how does my story end?" "That depends," Morse said, "on whether you wrote it or someone else did. He slid a copy of the poem across the metal counter. Crane's fingers brushed the paper, trembling ever so slightly. This was found in Lydia Trent's coat pocket last night. She said you gave it to her. Crane looked down, eyes scanning the verses. Beautiful, isn't it? The rhythm, the weight. It's the kind of thing my father would have admired. Your father's ghost has haunted every line, Morse said quietly. You didn't just want to avenge him, you wanted to become him, to finish what he started, to make his story immortal. Crane's jaw tightened. He was erased, his words stolen, his reputation destroyed by the same men you now call victims. You think that doesn't deserve retribution? No, Morse said simply. But I think you don't understand what justice is. Crane's eyes darkened. Justice, he whispered, is when the truth finally rhymes. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the distant echo of a closing door filled the silence. Then Lewis stepped closer, placing a photograph on the table. We found this in Lydia's flat, he said. It's from last week. You and her by the river. Looks like she wasn't just helping you, right? Was she? Crane's composure faltered. She loved my father's work. She wanted to help me restore it. She wanted to own it, Morse corrected, his voice steady. You were her tool, Elliot. You thought you were avenging your father, but she was rewriting history for herself. That missing poem from the anthology, the one your father supposedly destroyed, she had it. She's the one who leaked the first death scene to Vale. Crane's eyes widened, disbelief trembling on the edge of collapse. No, she wouldn't. She did, Morse said quietly. And now she's gone. Crane's voice broke. Gone. She visited you last night? Told the guards she was bringing you comfort. After she left, she disappeared. Her car was found near Magdalen Bridge. Crane rose suddenly, hands pressed to the glass, eyes wild. You have to find her. Chi-Chi said she was going to finish the work. Morse stood, his tone hardening. That's what I intend to do. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to fade. The city was slipping again into that uneasy twilight Morse had come to know so well, the hour when Oxford's beauty turned ghostly, when its secrets came alive. They found the car easily enough abandoned by the bridge, driver's door open, water dripping from the rail. And there, lying beside the riverbank, was a small leather notebook. Morse crouched and lifted it carefully, the initials embossed in gold. LT. He opened it. The pages were filled with verses, some crossed out, others written in haste. And near the end, one poem stood alone, stark and final. The poet dies where truth began, beneath the bridge, beside the span. His son will write, his heart will fail, the final word shall end the tale. Lewis read over his shoulder, frowning. She's telling us where she is. Morse straightened, scanning the river. No, he said softly. She's telling us where she'll die. They followed the path along the bank, the light thinning, the air damp with the scent of riverweed. Then, in the shallows beneath the bridge, a pale figure drifted in the current, her coat spreading like dark wings around her. Lewis froze. God. Morse waded in, the cold biting through his shoes, and pulled her toward the bank. Lydia Trent's eyes were open but empty, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Clutched in her hand was a photograph of Elliot Crane, taken years ago. His face overlaid with the words, "For him, the poem never ends." Back at the station, Morse stood by the evidence board long after Lewis had gone home. The river's reflection still haunted his thoughts, the words looping through his head like a melody that refused to fade. He reached for the poem again, tracing the final line with his thumb. Then, with a quiet certainty, he picked up his pen and wrote beneath it, "The poet sleeps. The reader knows, but some truths are best left prose." He set the pen down, exhaled, and allowed the silence to settle. Outside, dawn touched the city once more. The bells of Magdalen began their slow, mournful toll, and for a brief moment, Morse thought he heard the echo of a verse carried on the wind soft, haunting, and finally at peace. He closed the file. The final stanza, he murmured to himself, and a terrible poem at that. Then, with a weary half-smile, he reached for his coat. "Come on, Louis," he said quietly to the empty room. "Time for breakfast."